Hello everyone. After the disappointment of Banpresto Relax Time's take on ReZero's first villainess Elsa, my expectations for the Relax Time Echidna prize figure has been appropriately tempered by that past experience. As with Elsa before her, Echidna in this series of figures, at least those related to ReZero antagonists, is clad in the colors of her iconic Witch of Greed dress that is black, but in the form of sleepwear instead. Who is the Witch of Greed? Well, to keep a long story short and spoilers to a minimum, it suffices to say Echidna debuts as a major supporting character in the fourth arc of ReZero, but later on becomes a secondary antagonist instead. I'm actually quite intrigued by this Echidna figure by Banpresto for its Relax Time line, more so with the interesting base in the form of a chair they had included. So let's get started with her unboxing now. For the Relax Time Echidna box art, Banpresto used photographic images of the figure sitting on the chair, either sans any backdrop or, as is mostly the case you see here, backdropped with an ornate table set with a candelabrum and a tea set, the latter of which is referencing an important scene in the ReZero anime. The front box art shows Echidna against an out-of-focus wallpaper behind her, and below her is the Relax Time logo with its unique font type. On the right is a top-down view of her and one sans any backdrop, while at the back is Echidna zoomed in from a slightly bottom-up view. Lastly, on the left we have descriptions in Japanese and an image of her looking right into the camera, which brings us back to the front. Now that we have gotten a look at Echidna at her very best via the professionally taken photos, let's proceed with the unboxing and see if the actual figure itself lives up to her promising images. Similar to the other ReZero Relax Time figure, protection comes in a form of hard cardboard surrounding parts of the pre-painted figure, which is wrapped in plastic. And being much more complex than the Elsa figure, whose video link I've included in the description below by the way, Echidna comprises 6 separate parts, wrapped in 4 different compartments on the plastic wrap. The number of separate parts making up the Relax Time Echidna figure attests to its inherent complexity. But before we take a look at the individual pieces, I'm going to get them out from the plastic first. What I'm doing here is rolling up the plastic so that one end is stacked up against each other, thus making it easier for me to cut an opening in the plastic, like you see me doing here now. But it's not working out the way I had planned because the ends of the plastic wasn't sealed properly. The seal was crooked and not in a straight line. What this means is that although I was cutting the ends in a straight and even manner, parts of the sealed plastic remained uncut. Anyway, the plastic wrapping is now cut open. I'm going to remove the parts from their individual compartments, starting with the largest piece, which is Echidna's body and limbs, followed by her head and hair. Let me just move the parts making up Echidna herself to one side of the cutting mat first, so that I have enough space on the mat to place the remaining parts. Next, we have the parts that make up the chair that the Echidna figure sits on, starting with the seat of the chair, followed by the back support, the high back section of the chair, to which the back legs are attached, as well as the front legs, which come in 2 separate pieces. Now, before I proceed to assemble all the parts that you see laid out here on the azure cutting mat, let's have a quick close-up look at all the individual pieces to see what actually we'll be working with. Based on what I've glanced at so far when removing the parts from their plastic wrappings, Echidna seems to suffer from the same issues that Elsa did, despite being a more complex figure overall. I'll begin the once-over of the individual parts with Echidna's body and limbs, which comes in one large single piece. And as I'm trying to show here, there are unsightly molines running along the whole length of the front as well as back of her legs. And while there are no molines on the back, unfortunately they also exist on the outside of both her arms, which, like her legs and other parts of her exposed skin tone, have no shadows or highlights painted. As for Echidna's head and hair, the paint job is better in that her cheeks have blushes and her eyelashes and eye colour were accurately done up, while her snow white hair is given light violet shadows and clear plastic highlights. In terms of likeness, the figure's face bears a striking resemblance to her anime counterpart, helped in part by the faultless hairstyle and black butterfly hair clip accessory. I'm impressed by how accurately Banpresto portrayed Echidna's black eyes with a hint of purple, her white eyelashes, the aforementioned hair clip, her smile, the shape of her nose and face, plus the ever-present blush on her cheeks. Banpresto certainly scored highly on the likeness factor. How about her display stand or base that comes in the form of a four-legged high-back chair? Well, that comes in 4 separate pieces as I'm showing here. The details look good, although its monotone black molded in color looks kind of dull and uninspiring. Let's go ahead to assemble these parts and see just how well they all fit together. So I'll begin the assembly process by first piecing together the high-back chair that Echidna will sit on, starting with the seat, which has 2 holes underneath it that serves as the connection point for the chair's front legs. Therefore, connecting the front legs to the seat is done via a simple pack and hold joint. The chair's legs are nicely sculpted with an ornate-looking design. Once both front legs are attached, the next step involves fixing the seat onto the high-back section of the chair, which already has the other 2 legs fixed to it. Now it's going to seem like I'll be taking an inordinate amount of time to attach the seat and its 2 front legs to the high-back section of the chair, i.e. the part with the 2 back legs. But I'm actually erring on the side of caution and making sure all connections on the chair are sufficiently secure and tight. This is because the last thing I want happening is for the chair to come apart while the figure is still seated on it. This will cause the figure to fall and most likely damage something. So please bear with me as I try to ensure the structural integrity of the chair. There, I think the chair is sturdy enough now to bear the figure's weight. So I'll move on to the assembly of Echidna herself, which should be much simpler, seeing that it only involves inserting the hole found at the base of her head onto a pack located on her neck. I guess a certain amount of caution is called for in order to prevent her hair from getting damaged during the assembly process. Yet this becomes a non-issue if the shapes on the pack and hold joint system have been aligned properly, as I'm trying to do here. Because of the way the hole and pack are shaped, there's really only one way Echidna's head will fit onto her neck. That is, with her head turned sideways, like she's looking at someone or something to her left. So once I'm sure of the alignment, all that's left for me to do is to firmly push Echidna's head onto her neck for a secure and tight fit. I believe that's about as secure as I can get her head to fit onto her neck. Next will be to sit Echidna onto the high-back chair. There is, however, no connection or joint system that attaches her bottom securely onto the chair seat. Instead, I'll be using 2 reference points to position her correctly onto the chair. First is to position her left hand in such a way that her palm rests flatly on the seat while the fingers grip the edge of the seat. Second is to position her right leg so that her toes touch the ground. That then concludes the assembly process. For our prize figure, this Banpresto Relax Time version of Echidna from ReZero has an impressive sculpt complexity that, when coupled with an excellent character likeness factor, makes for a compelling reason to be added to your figure collection, especially if you're a ReZero fan. All this, however, just adds to my frustration at the unsightly mole lines and, to a lesser extent, the lack of skin tone shading. Putting aside her imperfections for the time being, yet another impressive characteristic of this Relax Time figure is that Echidna has considerable shelf presence. Even seated as she is, she measures at about 20.5 centimeters in height, from the bottom of the chair legs to the top of her head. Combining the significant size with her stylistically well-designed pose results in a shelf presence that not only catches your eye, but gives you a reason to maintain eye contact. One of Echidna's features that will draw the most attention, especially on this relaxed time pose she has adopted, is her fair skin, long and shapely legs, which she crosses while seated on that high back chair. Perhaps an unintended consequence of the extremely fair skin tone that Banpresto had adopted to accurately depict the character's appearance was that it somewhat hides the mole lines running along the front and back of her legs, as well as along the side of her arms. Meanwhile, Echidna's sit-down pose still manages to generate feminine S-curves via her leg positioning and her long wavy hair, despite her rather stiff back posture. From this close-up of Echidna's upper half, you'll better appreciate just how well Banpresto has sculpted and painted her face. From her unique hairstyle in which her long flowing hair is parted 4 ways, long at the back, medium length at the sides, and short at the front, to her big black eyes with hints of purple and her white eyelashes, the ever-present blush on her cheeks, to the shape of her face and nose, as well as her nonchalant smile. All are details that make this a figure with a near-perfect resemblance to the Witch of Greed character from ReZero. Like her skin tone, Echidna's sleepwear is devoid of any shading. It's sculpted in a glossy black with a texture that looks too plasticky for my taste. Also in this case, it looks leathery rather than silky as I would expect for a 90s sleepwear. Thankfully though, that lack of paint shading does not extend to her hair, which has clear plastic for highlights and light violet for shading on what's supposed to be a predominantly white coloured hair. Unfortunately, the lack of skin tone shading is made more obvious by the fact that her toenails are unpainted. Likewise, her fingernails are similarly unpainted. Echidna was seated on the chair in such a way that her left palm rests on the front left corner of the seat, while the tips of her right foot's toes are just barely touching the floor. Although this is not a definitive positioning of Echidna in her chair, it's one that works for me. All 4 legs of the high back chair rest level on the ground without shaking. This provides a solid foundation for the figure to sit on. Weighing all that this Banpresto Relax Time price figure of Echidna has to offer against flaws inherent in budget-friendly pre-painted figures, I'm giving her a rating of Platinum or B rank. So why am I giving her a fairly good rating despite the existence of mole lines on her arms and legs? Well, to a certain degree, the lines were mitigated by her extremely fair skin, which made the lines less obvious. The character's fair skin appearance also made skin tone shading less of an issue than it would usually be. So that left her unpainted toenails and fingernails, which is still a sore point for me, seeing how it could have been an opportunity to add colour to the piece. As such, it was a limiting factor that prevented her from being considered for a higher rating. And while the dull glossy blacks of her sleepwear weren't very inspiring either, at least it was nicely designed and sculpted, thus became a neutral factor. Now that I've dealt with her flaws, let me explain why I feel that Echidna's positive characteristics were good enough to push her to a Platinum or B rank. For one, I love how alike this Relax Time figure resembles Echidna, aka the Witch of Greed from the ReZero anime in all aspects of her looks, except of course for her clothes. This is a key positive for this figure. Couple that with her unique and lovely pose, as well as a rather large size, and you have a figure with considerable shelf presence that surpasses most other price figures. In other words, she lies above the average fare you find in the price figure category. All this makes the Banpresto Relax Time Echidna price figure a good addition to any figure collection, more so if you're a ReZero fan. Well, that's all the time we have for this unboxing and review video. Please do subscribe to my channel for more content, and also please hit the like button if you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching, be well and be happy.